Heavensward launched in 2015 to critical acclaim, in a shift for the MMO that, according to this reviewer on the internet, is an outstanding improvement upon the original Final Fantasy XIV experience. In fact, pretty much all of the reviews were glowing, with pundits absolutely loving this new offering, especially this guy, who might have just loved it a little bit too much. Entrancing. It's like magic, guys. Time disappears when this game and I are together, and I never want it to end. I'm not sure if this is a love that will last forever, but if it is, you'll get no complaints from me. Along with the content, though, came a much more sweeping evolution to job design across the board. Every role received much more comprehensive reworking and growth than newer players will be used to from the release of a new 0.0 patch. Rather than simply gaining an extra OGCD cooldown or two and maybe a nice skill upgrade or passive, as was the case for the most part in Dawntrail, in Heavensward, many jobs were nigh unrecognizable from their A Realm Reborn iterations. Black Mage is a great example of this. In A Realm Reborn, it was almost solely a proc-based job. You'd spam Fire 1 using Fire 3 whenever you got a Fire starter proc, refreshing Thunder as needed and replenishing your mana in Blizzard cycles. Heavensward introduced Enochian, which at the time constantly reduced in duration with each damage cycle that went by, making it an extremely active timer that you'd constantly be managing, because without it, you wouldn't be able to utilize your newly added Fire 4 and Blizzard 4. The job went from focusing solely on those procs to managing Enochian and your extremely limited movement that resulted from its strict timers and your long casts, but it didn't sacrifice that proc management either. Instead, it expanded upon it, introducing sharp cast to build freedom within your rotation to get through mechanics in one piece. But by far the biggest change came to physical range DPS. At the time, Bard was the only job within the role, though Machinist was added to create a duo with Heavensward, and the core of the role underwent a metamorphosis. Previously, it was simple. You throw up your various damage buffs, apply your dots, weave in your various abilities, keep up your straight shot buff, and use filler in between all of that. You also had songs such as one called Foe's Requiem that would passively drain your MP over time, allowing the party to deal increased damage to enemies. In fact, breaking it down like that, it's very reminiscent of the Bard that existed in Endwalker, and even that of today, for the most part at least. That said, it was firmly situated within the role of a supportive DPS. Heck, it even had a healer limit break instead of its current one if you needed any more convincing on its intent by the developers. But in Heavensward, drastic change was implemented, with the addition of a new song, Wanderer's Minuet. This is learnt at the first major progression increment of the expansion at level 52, and increased your damage by a whopping 30%, in exchange for switching off auto attacks and turning your GCDs into half casts, in much the same way that spells like Glare, Broil, and Malefic exist right now. This was, for all intents and purposes, caster stance, which you could turn on and off, and you'd want to maintain as much time with it enabled as possible to deal more damage. You also got Iron Jaws, a huge quality of life improvement that allowed the instant refresh of both buffs at the same time, one which feels indistinguishable from the core design of the job itself today. The third major addition was in Imperial Arrow, a fairly innocuous OGCD today, but on its first introduction was a cast bar weapon skill, not ability, on a short 15-second base cooldown that does not share a recast timer with any other action, and was only castable under your new special DPS caster stance. This meant that you could cast Straight Shot, then immediately cast this afterwards without needing to finish rolling your GCD first, leading to some interesting thought processes and interactions, something that we have seldom ever seen since. Bard was now a totally new job in terms of feel, with players juggling everything they'd managed before, but now also being faced with choices in how they traverse the arena. You could switch off Wanderer's Minuet and move freely without a care in the world, but you'd do so at the cost of a major chunk of your damage potential. Or you could carefully slidecast your way there, making use of your half-cast to get there slowly and steadily, using your ace in the hole, comically, of cross-classing Dragoon's Feint, a skill even its initial owner didn't use, to provide you additional movement even within your caster song. It was different, it was risky, it was a fresh take on Bard that kept much of what was present before, but built on top of it with both new toys and new challenges. Machinist was designed from the ground up with this same design philosophy in mind. Machinist had a proc-based rotation. Their basic combo actions had half-casts naturally, that you couldn't combo from 1 to 2 to 3 unless you got the proc. Procs were instant weapon skills, much like Machinist combos today, and you also had a cache of ammo available via cooldowns that could force procs to the 100% success rate. What resulted was this really interesting combo system, where you'd be building up your procs to spend during movement or burst windows, and that you didn't need to cleanly follow the tree from start to end. You could, for example, via ammo and stockpile, prepare both a 2 and a 3 proc, and then do 3, 2, 1, 3, 2, 3, should you have the ammo available to enable this, with only the 1 being casted. This system alone was really satisfying to master, because it meant that you would stockpile free movement for the phases where you needed it most. But it didn't just have that. It was supplemented by Wildfire, which was very different to its current iteration. No heat blast spam, or damage based on number of GCDs hit like it is now. Instead, it literally just compiled a quarter of your damage dealt while it was active, and smacked it onto your foe at the end. Alongside your turret buddies, these make up the core of Machinist's kit at level 60. It hadn't yet evolved into the multi-tool compendium it is now, focusing on a simple yet compelling job fantasy. Both ranged had limited movement that could be worked around in various ways. Complex rotations that rivaled or sometimes exceeded the other DPS rotations in terms of difficulty, and gained their own LB that dealt damage instead of being used for party recovery. Their supportive nature was still there to an extent. They were able to replenish the mana and TP of their fellow party members of note, alongside various unique mitigations, but they grew into a fully fledged damaging role that was not only important but outright brokenly strong by the halfway point of the expansion. Many speedrun groups were cutting their caster in exchange for a second Fizz ranged, in order to field both Machinist and Bard together, as their damage potential by skilled hands was just unstoppable. They had it all, but despite being strong and adored by many, this was a divisive time. For every player that loved physical ranged in its new form, there was another that hated it. Complaints erupted across the official forums that jobs like Bard should not have cast bars, they shouldn't have been added, and the role should much more closely resemble the A Realm Reborn iterations. This feedback was closely noted too, because when Stormblood released 2 years later, caster ranged were gone, entirely erased from existence with a snap of the fingers. From there, Bard mostly resembled the foundation of the job we're playing today. Machinist had a bit of an identity crisis, taking an additional expansion of flailing to get there, which I suppose makes sense when we consider that it was designed from the ground up with those procs and cast combos in mind. The changes from then on will likely become more familiar to many of you. With each passing year, pain points were removed one by one from rotations, becoming simpler and more linked to the building and spending of gauges. Encounters too changed in the way they were formulated, with less and less moments for ranged DPS to shine as kiters or baiters consistently. Serana raised some excellent examples of this during my recent video focused on the role, and how that has taken more of a backseat as of late.
The core problem that I have with the ranged physical role right now is that it really just doesn't have anything it really shines in. It leaves players that devote their time to the role without feeling like they make any specific major tangible contributions to the raid group. I often feel like I'm unable to really carry any particular aspect of a raid when I play well. The role overall has demonstrably lower damage value compared to the rest of the damage dealers. Its defensive cooldowns, outside of the usual universal raid mitt that every role gets, often feel kind of unnecessary in anything but really highly organized play, and players aren't really left with any other personal responsibility. You're kind of just there to do mechanics, you do your rotation, and you can't really influence the outcome of a raid in any meaningful way outside of just existing. Rather than mess too much with the job kits, I feel it'd be best to introduce more utility usage in raid design instead. The rare time I get to leverage the Warden's Pain on Bard to cover an Esuna leaves me super excited, and there's plenty of space in encounters to begin including more things like interrupts or Esunas or other utility usage. In addition to that, I feel like there's a ton of potential in designing a larger number of baited mechanics, such that the role with full free range of movement could have it delegated to them to simplify the solution. Some of my favorite moments in Stormblood revolve around having a mechanic such as Liquid Hells in UCOB, or baiting the giant AoE puddles in O11S's Pantocrator, which were things that my role was the best equipped to do. Leaning into that design more in raid encounters would give Range Physical a really meaningful space on the team.
After all that, now we're here. Physical range DPS is hurting, struggling to find its place in not only the meta of the game, but in the hearts of a large percentage of the player base. Not quite a support DPS as it was in A Realm Reborn, nor fully committed to dealing damage the same way that melee and caster DPS are today, which I think is partly a balancing decision on Square Enix's end, and fear of replicating the Bard and Machinist of Midas and Creator. Fight design doesn't allow it to find its place as a beta or cement its position specifically due to its free movement. So for the most part it endures thanks to that 1% buff per role added a few expansions ago, which acts as a necessary lifeline, and through those that enjoy the jobs and are going to stick with them regardless of any issues. It's just kind of there, lacking a real foundational identity that feels both good and is essential to party success. It went from a support DPS to being provided extra rotational mechanics that allowed it to be balanced, to truly shine as a damage dealer, to being reverted, but given fight-specific moments of glory as a beta, to given, well, maybe one extra mitigation than other DPS roles have. Feels like a huge step back, and more than that, it feels like there's stagnation within the role. We aren't moving forward. I'm definitely not alone in feeling this way either. This topic is like the ever-roiling maelstrom, not quite taking place as the community's hot topic of the week, but always something people care about and would like to see some kind of resolution on. I think it's realistic that we can't expect any meaningful progress until patch 8.0 releases a good 2 years from now. And that's reasonable, but I would definitely be in the camp that would be sorely disappointed to see no decisive stance taken on how Bard, Machinist, Dancer, and their potential new younger sibling should be handled going forward. I definitely don't have all the answers, and additionally, I don't feel that in giving good feedback you need to have all the answers. After all, I'm a consumer and not the developer, and it's their job to figure out a path forward if they reach the same conclusion that myself and many players have. Despite all that being true, here's how my thought process on the matter turns out. You can either make physical range more interesting, strong, and impactful through changing fight design, or through changing job design. The ideal solution is to do both to different extents and find a lovely middle ground, but a success state would be to decide what they want physical range to be, and then figure out how, through either or both of these routes, they can forge it into that identity. Is it a support DPS? Does the support DPS role not exist? And is it instead a DPS like any other, with values to match that? Is it some in between that we haven't yet fully established? Whichever Square Enix lands on, they need to lean more heavily into making that feel important and fulfilling. If they choose to lean into that supportive role, they need to quantify it. It could be through increasing the number of interruptible silences and stuns in content, especially those that do more than just make you take a little extra damage if you fail. There's a fine line between making them required and making them optional, but feel rewarding and useful to make sure you keep up with. But right now, Phys Ranged is the only role that has access to both simultaneously, making them the ideal party slot to be in charge of those responsibilities. Alternatively, seeing as Expedience on Scholar has been so well received, you could give Phys Ranged access to Combat Peloton on a cooldown, with each job getting a unique secondary buff alongside that move speed. You could provide more forms of active mitigation or healer support, and slot this role into one that has a much more active DPS rotation than healers, and can alongside that provide a decent amount in the way of healing and mitigation via buffing the healers and tanks. Removed abilities such as Palisade are exactly kind of what I'm talking about here. This doesn't change gameplay too much in casual content at low skill levels, but it provides a unique niche to lean into and practice alongside from just the damaging rotation. They could add entirely new support skills instead as well, and maybe that's the option I'd personally prefer. In terms of fight design, if they're going to keep free movement in its current form with absolutely nothing impeding arena traversal, it would be nice to implement more regular baited mechanics, like those in Panzer Crater, or even, as a wilder and older example, T7 of Coil, Melusine, where you need to kite the big old Cyclops for extended periods of time, and the Fizz range DPS was just built different for those responsibilities. Without them, it leaves an odd status quo. Every other role in the game has something that sets them apart in terms of unique challenges that they need to overcome in their general gameplay. Tanks have aggro management, enemy positioning, and using their defensives in an active manner for autos and busters. Healers have to wrestle with both cast bars and keeping the party's HP bars topped. The brunt of the responsibility and burden of failure falls on them in that regard. Melee must deal with keeping uptime and managing their positionals effectively, and casters have cast bars too, but are also the only DPS role that can dip into raising in any capacity as well. I think I even mentioned or alluded to it a little bit earlier, but I genuinely believe that this ease of play that Physical Ranged has compared to the rest of the DPS roles is one of the major factors that result in Square Enix being hesitant to allow them to become as powerful numbers-wise as Melee and Casters peak. But Square Enix have already implemented something that could remove the inhibitors on range damage potential. You know, in PvP, Bard and Machinist skills have channels. Cast bars, but you can walk during them but not move at full speed. What about having those linked to short cooldowns? Not your fillers, because it would be too much of a return to the so reviled Heaven's Ward iterations as much as I enjoyed them, but instead, skills like your tools on Machinist or Imperial Arrow on Bard could get those channel casts. This forces more thought into arena traversal, but doesn't prevent you from moving freely too much, and you can just drop a bit of damage if you need to, and it would also allow the developers to feel more free to increase that damage potential a little bit. A nice middle ground like that wouldn't go amiss. Like I said, really here, I'm just throwing random ideas at the wall, and I doubt any of them will be the final product unaltered, though I wouldn't be too surprised to see flashes of either one or some of them creep their way into 8.0. Rather than my random suggestions being the thing that sticks with you from this video, I hope the issues raised and the reduction in satisfaction within the role are those that resonate, and that you too will want to see the shunned child within the DPS roles grow in the next expansion. Realistically though, I'm okay with whatever ends up happening as long as we experience some kind of change. Right now I think there's stagnation in a big way, and I want to be excited about physical range DPS again. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.